long ago, in a far-off land.
This particular land happens to have a name, which is not usually the case when people say in a far-off land. But this land is called Jotunheim, which translates for English as the world of the giants. Giant land, like from Mario Bros. 3.
Thor and Loki were looking for a place to rest on their long journey.
What was their journey? It is never covered. Why they're in Jotunheim, no one knows, but this is their first stop.
They came upon the farm of a mortal family and struck a deal for shelter through the night. To the bewilderment of the mortals, Thor stepped down from his flying chariot, which was pulled by the two great goats, Tongrisnia, the teeth bearer, and Tongioster, the teeth grinder.
Yup, here's something that those wacky Disney folks left out of them Marvel movies. Thor has got a flying chariot drawn by two flying goats, named basically Gnasher and Biter, like just dumb goat names, just ferocious goats. They're huge, they're the size of horses, and they fly through the air, and they pull him like Santa Claus. I can't overemphasize this enough. It's hilarious.
I would shareth would thou the mutton from my own goats, if thou would shareth thine's roofs for the night.
The mortals gladly accepted Thor's offer, as it was considered a great honor to play host to the gods. Thor slaughtered his mystical goats and carved them up for cooking. He did, however, offer one warning.
You may eat from the flesh of my mighty goats until you have had your fill. You must, however, leave their bones intact for the resurrection upon the morn.
And, of course, the mortals followed those simple instructions, and that's the end of the story. So thanks for listening to Super Geeky Play Date. Be sure to tune in next week when we're going to cover... Oh, no, wait! Of course, they f***ed that up.
The children of the peasants, a brother and sister, called Jalfi and Roskava, became enamored by the deliciousness of the enchanted meat. Without even realizing it, the two had cracked the bones in order to taste the sweet marrow within. In the morning when Thor awoke, he went about the process of collecting the bones of his sacred goats and placing them into a pile. With his magic hammer Mjolnir, he struck the pile of bones, and miraculously, Tongrisnia and Tongioster returned to life before the mortals' eyes.
Well, hey, maybe he won't notice.
Thor noticed instantly that Tongrisnia now had a limp and could no longer pull the mighty chariot. Furious at the mortals, Thor demanded payment. Since the mortals had nothing else to give, they sold their children into the gods' employ.
Now, selling your kids into slavery is a pretty horrible thing, but at this point in the story, I like to imagine that they're like a fun group. They're all together, camping in the wilderness. They tell ghost stories around the campfire. This is fun. This is fun. They're having fun. Everyone's having fun here.
The group set forth upon their journey into the land of the giants. Two frightened children, a trickster, and the mighty Thor barreling on.
Hi, I'm Brady, and this is story time. That's right, we're back with another story time with Brady. Thank you very much, guys, for downloading this episode. Sorry that it's been a little while, but kind of the fun of this podcast is that I kind of get to do it whenever I feel like it. So there's not really ever going to be kind of deadlines on it. But regardless, we're back, and we're telling the first story that I personally ever heard from Norse mythology. So all of Norse mythology comes to us in two books that are called the Edda or the Edda. They are what is now known as the prose Edda, and an older collection of poems without an original title, which we call the Poetic Edda. Stories about Thor and Loki and Odin and stuff all come from these books. But this specific story may have actually had editing done by Christian scholars. The story, not to get into too much spoiler territory, but it kind of makes Thor look very foolish. And this might have been a version of the story that was told later on, once Christianity kind of started getting into the region. Like it may have been almost a little bit of a propaganda story in order to tarnish Thor's good name, make him seem foolish and mortal rather than godly. I'm going to be doing a lot of stories from Norse mythology because there's a whole bunch of really cool ones, but this is absolutely by far my favorite. So I really hope that you enjoy it too. If you didn't know, I come from the podcast Super Geeky Playdate, where I get to geek out with my very good friends, Brian Bales, Adam Matson, and Matthew Koenig. If you haven't checked that out yet, please do. And please remember to rate and review. And now, without further ado, let's get back to the story.
The heroes came upon the vast forest of the giants and continued through it until dark. Seeking shelter, the four came upon an immense building with 5 great halls within. They chose one hall and made camp, where they ate their meager provisions and fell asleep. Their sleep was a short one, however, as in the middle of the night, an earthquake began and did not stop until morning. The children and Loki awoke terrified, but Thor merely opened his eyes and gripped his hammer tight. In the morning, the heroes stirred and left their shelter, only to lay eyes upon the largest creature any of them had ever seen. His name was Skimir, and he was searching for his missing glove. As he turned around and saw the heroes, he reached down and grabbed their building and put it back upon his hand.
So Thor fights giants all the time. That's his thing. That is his middle name. Thor, fighting giants, Odinson. He's always fighting the frost giants. These are the people that he grew up in battle with. He knows this enemy very, very well. Skimir, on the other hand, is a totally different sort of giant. This is, like I like to think of it, as a fee-fi-fo-fum giant. Like, the frost giants were big. They were real big. They were probably 10 feet tall. But this giant is 40 feet tall. It's the largest creature that Thor has ever seen, and that is going to be every giant that we encounter throughout this realm. Thor is not in Kansas anymore.
Oh, hey. Nice to see you down there,
said the lumbering giant.
We are both traveling these woods, so we should go together. I can carry your gear, and you can keep me company.
Thor instantly did not trust the giant, but the food and drink that Skimir produced from his pouch was enough to win the thunder god over. The next night, the four slept under an oak tree near Skimir, but just as Thor was about to get the sleep he so sorely needed, the earthquakes began again. Infuriated, Thor went searching in the darkness for their cause, and he found Skimir snoring.
Oh man, Thor is having a bad couple of days. First his goat went lame, then he couldn't get any sleep the night before, and now he's got to team up with a giant, which he barely trusts, trying to get sleep again. This thing's causing earthquakes. Thor's not going to stand for this. Thor hates this. Thor's going to jump into action.
Thor jumped upon the sleeping Skimir and climbed his way to the giant's forehead. He then raised the great hammer Mjolnir, and then the mighty Thor brought down his great hammer upon the sleeping giant. and nothing happened.
Oh, hello, Thor.
Said the giant, gently stirring from his slumber.
Did you happen to see if an acorn just fell upon my head?
Thor, flabbergasted, embarrassed, but most of all enraged, left the giant to his sleep and went in search of food and drink.
So yeah, Thor goes to eat his feelings away, and he goes to the provisions that the group was kind of keeping together. Skimir had offered to carry all the provisions because he was so large, and he just he'd added them to his own provisions, which was a massive sack that was tied to his hip.
As Thor began to open the sack, he realized he was not strong enough to untie the knot. Baffled, he fought with it throughout the night, until the morning came. Skimir awoke pleasantly, and shot a questioning glance at the beleaguered Thor. He then began packing his things, and saying farewell to the travelers.
You guys have been good traveling partners. But I go this way now. Here's a word of caution, though, for your short-tempered friend.
Said the giant, gesturing towards Thor.
Stay away from the castle Jotunheim.
And with that, the giant left, leaving our heroes once again alone in the vast forest. What they came upon the next day was the largest castle anyone had ever seen.
Yeah, it was huge. It was so huge that it took up the whole horizon. There was no way for them to back up far enough that they could see the entire castle in one viewing. It was impossibly and magically large.
Thor charged into the main hall and saw dozens of giants eating their meals. A giant emerged from the back who was head and shoulders above everyone else.
If I didn't make it clear earlier, these are still those fee-fi-fo-fum giants. They're huge. They're ridiculously huge. They're bigger than anything Thor has ever seen.
His name was Utgard Loki, and this was his castle.
Utgard Loki means basically close enough Loki of the Outlaws. We could also just call him Loki of the fee-fi-fo-fum giants. All his name means is that he's the scheming trickster one of his friends.
As the giant came forth, Thor introduced himself to the room.
I am Thor, son of Odin, god of thunder. And I'm having a real bad case of the Mondays.
The leader looked Thor up and down and started to laugh.
From the stories I heard, I thought the mighty Thor would be bigger.
Tired, hungry, and now enraged at having been mocked, the mighty Thor gripped his hammer and attempted to lunge at the massive giant. Loki was quick to restrain his brother, however. He was able to plainly see that not even the mighty Thor could hope to win a battle that was this unbalanced.
Let's try to have cooler heads prevail here, brother, please.
Said Loki. Then turning to Utgard Loki, he said,
Surely there is some task that we can, complete, for you, in order to earn our room and board for just the night.
Utgard Loki thought for a while, and then smiled knowingly to his men.
All we seek is entertainment. Show us what you can do.
Loki was the first to speak up, and he announced that he could eat faster than any being alive.
Kind of a weird thing. This whole story is sort of about Thor and then some characters around him. So whereas Loki is far more fleshed out in other stories in Norse mythology. In this one, he's just sort of playing a plot device. That's what the other people around Thor really are. So for some reason, he can eat faster than anybody else in the world, which is not a thing that's ever come up before or since.
Utgard Loki prepared 2 giant troughs, filled to the brim with food. As Loki took his position in front of one trough, Utgard Loki chose one of his men seemingly at random and landed upon the giant known as Logi. He looked to be meek and somewhat frail. Utgard Loki blew his whistle, and both competitors began eating at a furious pace. The two remained neck and neck throughout, the only difference between them being that as Loki ate, he became more sluggish, but when Loki ate, he became more ferocious.
He also stopped being so frail looking, became larger as he ate, and became more and more formidable. Weird, right? What's going on with this guy?
As the contest ended, both sides moved in to examine the remains of the food. Loki had eaten all of the meat and all of the bones, but Logi had eaten the trough as well.
Pretty sneaky, sis.
Next, Utgard Loki demanded a foot race. Jalfi, the mortal boy, said he could outrun any living being.
Yep, so again, why can the boy run faster than any other being alive? He's just a mortal, farm boy. Literally just because the story needs him to right now. Oh, and by the way, his sister's just gone. Yep. That was it. That was all for her. She will not make another appearance. I assume she's there, but she is not mentioned. Roskva was her name. Not mentioned anymore. Don't know why the story had Thor bringing along 2 kids. Doesn't make any sense.
Utgard Loki pitted the boy against a giant named Hugi. The two set off to lap the gigantic castle. But shortly after the race had begun, Hugi had already returned to the finish line. The two raced several more times. The boy Jalfi lost to his opponent first by an arrow's length, then by the length of a hand, and finally by the length of a hair. Still, he could not manage to cross the finish line before his opponent.
Your team has not done well, Thor,
said the great Utgard Loki.
Show us what you can do. What is the mighty Thor good at?
Thor responded plainly, with no hint of boast, as a man simply stating a fact. He said,
Drinking.
Utgard Loki sent for his cupbearer, who produced the longest drinking horn that Thor had ever seen.
Thor wasn't worried, though. He was Thor.
I am able to drink this cup in 1 gulp. The more pathetic of my men can drain it in 2, but there are none among us who would dare take 3 gulps to finish the draft. Those men would be laughed out of the castle.
Thor waved away the giant's attempt to rattle him and feasted his eye on that massive drink. Licking his lips, Thor lifted the horn and began to drink. The giant's mead was cold and salty, but Thor drank until his thirst was quenched. He then drank for a little while longer, just to impress these foolish giants. When Thor lowered the horn, however, the draft had only gone down about the length of his finger.
Fear not, Thor. You can surely finish it with the next drink.
Thor began to drink again, this time with purpose. He drank deeply, and he drank well. And this time he knew that he had drained the cup. But when he set the drink down again, it had only lowered by about the length of his thumb.
So the tales of the mighty Thor are only tales,
said Utgard Loki.
Well, even so, we will allow you to drink the horn dry on your 3rd attempt. Surely there cannot be much left in there.
Mortified that he was being pitied, Thor drank so long and so fast that Loki could do nothing but stare in awe. Hours went by as Thor drank until he knew he could not go on. Dejected, he looked to see how much more he had drank, and found the cup had only gone down by the length of a knuckle.
Damn, Thor, you lightweight. This is particularly upsetting to Thor because he's competing against giants. Again, giants are the natural enemy of the Thor.
I did not know that these tasks would prove so difficult to the mighty Thor. Let me pick something easy this time for you. Do you think that you can lift my cat?
That's not completely as random as it sounds. Apparently there was a game in Castle Jotunheim where the kids would try to lift Utgard Loki's giant cat, and this was a game that the kids would play.
Yes, I think I could lift your cat.
A giant cat was then brought into the chambers. It was twice the size of the largest lion, and it looked at Thor passively and began to lick a paw.
Let me just cut to the chase on this one. Thor couldn't lift the cat. He tried. He grabbed it by its middle, and he tried to lift it above its head, but the cat just kept arching its back, and Thor is trying to stretch and lift and stretch, and it's like the cat's just sort of playing with him. Thor keeps trying though, and eventually he gets himself underneath one of its shoulders, underneath a leg, and he's able to lift one paw off the ground.
Enough,
said Utgard Loki.
It is not your fault that you cannot pick up a house cat. You are, after all, such a scrawny little fellow. Perhaps we should end our games, and I will give you asylum as compassion for the weak.
The eyes of Thor burned red as fire, and arcs of electricity bristled across his skin. He gripped his hammer Mjolnir with both hands, and the magic hammer bowed under the grip, ready to snap.
I will fight any man in this room!
Screamed Thor in a voice like cracking thunder. But Utgard Loki smiled softly to himself and calmly spoke.
Thor, none of my men would face you now. There would be no honor for them in fighting a man who cannot finish his drink and cannot pick up a pet. There is, however, one thing that comes to mind. My Nana.
Your Nana?
Do not scoff, Thor. This woman taught me to wrestle when I was young, and she still remembers how. Wrestle her to the ground, and you and your friends may stay.
Against his better judgment, Thor agreed to wrestle Nana. And as the woman was brought into the room, Thor realized she was the oldest thing that he had ever seen. She was small and frail, with only wisps of gray hair remaining on her ancient head. Thor did not want to hurt her, but he was anxious to show even some of his prowess to these infuriating giants.
Spoiler alert, Thor can't beat her. She's a wispy old gray G-Ma, and Thor cannot even get her to budge. He can't move her body in any way. But something weird and interesting does kind of happen. When she finally decides to go on the offensive, she grabs onto Thor by his leg, and suddenly his leg feels weak and it fails him, and he's got to drop to one knee. But this is as far as he lets her get him. She doesn't win either. She doesn't pin Thor to the ground, but she does drop him to one knee. They probably would have kept going, but then they heard,
Stop! You and your team have failed every task, Thor. You cannot stay under my roof. Leave the castle of Jotunheim and never return.
And the group did just that. Gloomily, they exited the castle as Utgard Loki walked them to the gates.
I have a confession to make to your group,
He said, after they had passed beneath the arch that delineated his property.
Your failures are not the reason that I will not allow you to stay within my walls. The truth is, I am terrified of your powers, and I use several magical deceptions to see just how powerful you are.
Utgard Loki revealed that he had been the giant Skimir, and when Thor had hit his sleeping form with the hammer Mjolnir, he had magically conjured a mountain in between his head and the hammer.
That's the mountain that I used over there, Thor.
But when Thor looked, he did not see a mountain, only a crater and a pile of rubble.
My plan was to deny you food so that you grew weaker, and the laces of my provisions bag were tied with unbreakable iron wire, and they could only be undone by magic.
As Thor thought this over, Loki looked up at the giant.
Tell me about last night. What trickery did you use then?
You lost only to the personification of fire.
Yep, Logi means fire in Old Norse.
Only fire becomes faster as it consumes.
The giant then turned to Jalfi.
How fast can you think, boy? Can you think faster than you can run? Well, that is what you faced. Hugi thought. Ran only barely faster than you.
Thor glanced up at the giant.
And I? What did I actually do last night?
You, Thor, performed miracles.
The giant then explained that the end of the drinking horn had been magically connected to the ocean.
You drank so much of the sea, Thor, that you have forever created tides.
And from then on, the sea would forever ebb and flow against the land.
And the cat you lifted was no cat at all, but Jormungand, the Midgard serpent, the snake that encompasses the earth. It is impossible to lift the Midgard serpent, and yet you did.
Yeah, it turns out if Thor would have looked out the window while he was picking up that cat paw, he would have seen a huge midsection of a giant world-encompassing serpent lifted into the sky.
And the old woman? Your Nana? What was she?
Her name was Ellie.
Ellie means old age.
No one can beat old age, because in the end she takes each of us, makes us weaker and weaker, until she closes our eyes for good. Except you, Thor. You wrestled with old age, and we marveled that you fell down to only one knee. Now that I see your powers, I realize how foolish I was to allow you to enter Castle Jotunheim. But I will never make that mistake again.
And with that, Jotunheim Loki disappeared. And so too did his magnificent castle.
So there kind of stood our heroes, just sort of in a empty, desolate plain, as if everything around them had just suddenly vanished. So as they trucked their way home, I like to think whenever the wind blew through the trees, Thor heard laughter. Hi, I'm Brady. Thanks for listening to Storytime. My guest this week was Tad Galusha. Special thanks to Neil Gaiman and the Myths and Legends podcast. Hey, do me a favor, and please rate,
and review.
Tune in next week as I try to give you a complex when we hear the story of Oedipus.